Here they are. Assalamu alaikum and good morning. Welcome everyone to day 3. Can't believe it's day 3 already of this incredible conference. Our panel this morning, we're very excited about. Panel 8 is on media, schooling, and campus life. We look forward to hearing from our speakers, our colleagues this morning. Our first speaker will be Dr. Leila Bdeir, who has been teaching in the humanities department since January 2010 at Vanier College. She's also actively participated in the Women and Gender Studies program there. She has a master's degree from the Université de Quebec à Montréal in political science, and she created the first course on Islamophobia at the Cégep level. It's called Who's Afraid of Arabs? She'll present today on experiences of Muslim students in Quebec colleges. Our next speaker will be Dr. Fatima Hendricks, who is a South African occupational therapist, occupational scientist, and educator working at the intersections of health, education, through decolonial practice, who will present today on Let's Talk, Islamophobia, Intergroup Dialogues on College Campuses. So we're looking forward to that. Someone were asking if she's actually come in all the way from South Africa, and she has, and I think like 10 stops on the way and on the way back. So we're especially grateful for everyone who has traveled from far and near to be here. And Dr. Zeinab Farokhi, who earned her PhD in Women and Gender Studies and Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto, and currently she's a SSHRC postdoctoral fellow. I should say SSHRC out loud so people know what it is. It's a Social Science, Humanities, and Research Council. In the US, it's usually just SSRC. So she's currently a SSHRC postdoctoral fellow at Concordia University and an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. And she'll present today on Grieving the Ungrievable, the construction of Muslim subjects in digital mourning spaces. So thank you all for being here, and please welcome Leila.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for giving us the space to gather and reflect collectively on these extremely important questions. I want to begin by acknowledging that we gather today on the territory of the Huichin, the original landscape of the Chechnya-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. I also acknowledge the Ganyagehaga Nation on whose territory this paper was written. When people talk about regulation of religious bodies and symbols in the context of Muslim communities in North America, it is often discussed as a relatively recent phenomenon, or as a phenomenon directed only towards those perceived to be new to the area. Itself, of course, a false perception when it comes to Muslims. Instead, I want to highlight that this kind of regulation of religious practices, as well as other questions of racism and racial violence, are integral to the histories of the settler colonies in which we work. This paper comes out of a 3-year participatory action research project, looking at the experiences of Muslim students in Cégep in Quebec. For those unfamiliar with the Cégep system, it is a Quebec-specific, publicly funded college system that students enter after completing grade 11, the last year of high school in Quebec. It offers 2-year pre-university diplomas and 3-year technical programs that prepare students directly for careers. My colleague Krista Riley and I acted as co-lead researchers for this project, and each year we worked with a team of 6 Cégep students whom we hired and trained as researchers. And while we already heard about the many ways that Islamophobia has been especially apparent in Quebec, let me mention that in the case of Muslim youth, particular attention has been paid to so-called radicalization, especially in the wake of incidents where some Cégep students were caught attempting to leave for Syria to join ISIS 2015 was a particularly notable year for this. From conferences to research centers, a lot of money and attention was directed towards studying radicalization among young Muslims. Given this reality, our precise objective in taking on this project was to build a different approach to research about and with Muslim communities. We wanted to try and understand the experiences of Muslim CEGEP students on their own terms. Using a participatory action research approach, this project has had as its goal to generate knowledge that would actually serve Muslim students, beginning by including them in the research design process. For each of the 3 years, we hired a group of mostly Muslim female students who acted as co-researchers and were involved in all stages of the research, developing interview questions, conducting interviews and focus groups, transcribing the data, analyzing the results, and writing sections of the final report. This research experience represents a rare opportunity for any student at the CEGEP level, and a particularly valuable one for this demographic that so often finds itself as the object of research and debate. As part of this work, we also made a particular effort to ensure a diverse representation of backgrounds and perspectives among both our research team members and our interview participants, with particular focus on ensuring that Black Muslim perspectives were represented and highlighted. One of the key issues that came up across our interviews was the weight of being visibly Muslim in Quebec, as well as the impact of being invisible as a Muslim individual in a climate, where Muslim identity is so politically charged. In today's presentation, I'd like to explore questions of visibility and invisibility, the lack of attention afforded to certain experiences, both within and outside Muslim communities, and the ways in which those exclusions become transplanted into the Quebec college setting. I will focus my remarks on 3 case studies offering testimonies from Muslim students whose experiences are often described as marginal, students whose Blackness or queerness position them outside the dominant narratives about Muslim life in Quebec. These perspectives offer a window into the complexity of Muslim student life at the intersections of multiple identities. Black feminist scholar Alexis Pauline Gomps writes that we are accountable when we are specific. In choosing to focus my remarks on so-called minority experiences, I hope to actually broaden conversations about Islamophobia, because the act of centering the margins of Muslim youth experiences helps us to better account for the myriad manifestations of Islamophobia and the ways in which it relies on numerous systems of oppression for its deployment. The first student I want to tell you about is Sumaya, who, as she herself puts it, lives at the intersection of several marginalized identities. She talked about being a Black African Muslimah as the most significant locations for understanding how she thinks about being Muslim. She told us, and I quote, "I am an African. So yeah, I'm a visible minority. And that's the main intersectionality that I live, is the fact that I'm Muslim and that I'm Black as well." Sumaya struggled with her sense of belonging to the Muslim community. Both in Quebec generally and within mainstream Muslim communities, the representations of Muslim women center the Francophone Arab experience and are closely connected to the practice of hijab. Furthermore, in Quebec, including within Muslim communities themselves, there is hardly any recognition, and a lot of ignorance actually, about the history of Black Muslim life on the land. Also, contrary to other parts of Canada where there are significant numbers of Black Muslim communities, in Quebec, there are not as many, and Muslim communities tend to self-segregate by language and ethnicity. It was therefore not surprising for us to hear from Sumaya that as someone who does not cover and is not Arab or South Asian, people she meets are often surprised to learn that she is Muslim, including other Muslims. She said, and the negative part of it is sometimes the people are like, "Really? You're Muslim? You don't look Muslim?" And that hurts me. What do you mean, I don't look Muslim? Sumaya confided during her interview that she felt less hurt when she faced this kind of ignorance from non-Muslims because, as she told us, she expects some degree of ignorance and prejudice from them. What she said was the hardest for her was how often she encountered other Muslims who expressed astonishment at her being Muslim and who questioned the legitimacy of her claims to Islam. Sumaya recounted how it's not uncommon for Arab Muslims in particular to seek to test her by questioning her practices. She recalled, for example, the time when one of her managers at her place of work, who was Moroccan, expressed astonishment when Sumaya told her she was Muslim, and then proceeded to ask, "Do you eat halal? Do you pray?" The person also asked her about her mother's choice of a name, which to her did not sound Islamic. Sumaya experienced this incident as an attempt to invalidate her claim of Muslimness, and named that it was unlikely that someone who was an Arab Muslim would face such incredulity. She told us, "You're really asking me that type of question that you would not ask if I was Arab or if I was, from Turkey?" For Sumaya, the exclusion and erasure she faced in terms of her Muslim identity was perpetuated mostly by her own community. During her interview, she repeatedly named the ignorance of many Muslims of the fact that millions of Muslims in the world are actually Black. She vigorously rejected the exceptionalism with which she was treated by non-Black Muslims, including really racist tropes like "you're pretty for a Black girl." That's what hurts me the most, because it's not like the Quebecois that would say that maybe he didn't have the education and the culture because only Muslim people he sees is on the media. That I would understand more, because it's more ignorance, but it's not his fault necessarily. But from a Muslim sister, a Muslim brother, saying that you don't look Muslim, how come you don't know that there's lots of Muslims in West Africa, in East Africa? And that's something that hurts me. And that's the bad experience of being Black and Muslim at the same time. Interestingly, Sumaya also recognized that within non-Muslim spaces, not being read as Muslim, therefore being invisible, gave her a sort of advantage or a privilege, she said, especially in such an Islamophobic context as Quebec. She told us, "Since people do not initially assume I'm Muslim, I don't tend to have comments, for example, for a girl that's wearing a hijab. She can hear comments about her, and that's awful. But yeah, I think I have that chance, if I can say that. It is a privilege. I remember because I work at Winners, and there was a girl wearing a hijab on cash, and then a customer came and said, 'These people.' And I was like, 'Really? Do you know that I'm Muslim?' So that was like one of my moments that I could use this privilege to, hit back. Of course, the privilege of not being the direct target of Islamophobia, if we can call it a privilege, is not such a straightforward position for Sumaya to be in. Not only is she constantly faced with anti-Black racism, but she also is privy to many Islamophobic comments pronounced by people believing there are no Muslims around to hear them. In fact, it is important to highlight that while her invisibility as a Muslim may serve to protect her from direct attacks, she is very aware of and affected by the rampant Islamophobia that pervades Quebec society, especially as it is relayed by the media. During the interview, she spoke at length of her astonishment when reading articles published by certain media outlets and the vitriolic responses that accompanied them. She mentioned a television journalist who called the attack on the Quebec City Mosque reverse terrorism, a comment suggesting that real or normal terrorism is only what is committed by Muslims, of course. Sumaya also spoke about the shooting in Quebec as a really particularly painful moment for her. "My mom knew one of the victims because we're from the same country. And I remember she went to the funeral right away. And that is an event that really, really marked me. I was still in high school. Even right now, when, he had to be judged, because at the moment when she was giving us the interview, Bissonnette, the shooter, was undergoing his trial for the sentence. Even now, when he had to be judged and people were saying so many awful things, and it's like they don't realize that there were so many lives broken at that time. Here Sumaya is describing the personal nature of this tragedy for her family. One of the effects of being erased as a Muslim is that she actually did not benefit from the support that was offered to people who were read as Muslim, and this despite the fact that she was the only one that we interviewed who claimed a direct connection to the victims of the attack. It's also noteworthy that while Sumaya experiences so much erasure, both within Muslim communities and by non-Muslim actors, she feels tremendous solidarity for other Muslims and for all groups who are marginalized. This is perhaps connected to the fact that as a Black Muslimah, her experiences of discrimination are multiple, and therefore she understands that her liberation depends on that of many others, and vice versa. She said, "I cannot sit here. I'm that kind of person. Even if it's not about Muslims or Blacks or women, just being part of so many communities, so many minorities, made me kind of an advocate for any other minority." Next, I'd like to talk to you about Azra, who is another student we met who spoke about not being readily read as Muslim. She identifies as queer and as Muslim, and she named that while she knows that she is visibly racialized, she is not necessarily assumed to be Muslim. She told us, and I quote, "I don't feel like if I walk down the street, no one is going to be like, a Muslim person, let's go beat her up, you know?" So just like Sumaya, Azra was aware that she benefited from some protection from Islamophobia because people did not always assume she was Muslim. Also like Sumaya, Azra had experienced moments when members of her own community had a hard time believing she was Muslim. In her interview, she described her experience of meeting another Muslimah at the college who expressed deep surprise at discovering that Azra was Muslim, to the point of almost not believing her. To help us better understand this experience, it's useful to hear how Azra describes it herself. "I'm just going to come out and say it. I'm very whitewashed. So within my own community, sometimes people are like, wow, you know, because they'll just be confused. So that gets really awkward sometimes, because I don't identify with white people at all. But I have dyed hair, and I'm super gay, you know? So yeah, sometimes it's a little bit uncomfortable." What Azra seems to be inferring is that, as she calls it, her super gay appearance that has made it hard for her Muslim peers to recognize her as Muslim. Of course, for many people both within and outside the Muslim community, queer and Muslim identities are seen as incompatible. So not only does Azra not wear hijab, which has come to symbolize Muslim femininity, she also presents a visibly queer appearance. The perception of these two identities as mutually exclusive illustrates and reinforces the very narrow perceptions of Muslims and reflects the inability to see them as complex individuals living like everyone with multiple and intersecting identities. The discussion by Azra of having dyed hair and having a quote-unquote super gay appearance, after having described herself as whitewashed, is also significant, especially since the whitewashed label seems to be an external one to Azra's own sense of herself. She told us clearly that she did not identify as or with white people and described these associations as awkward and uncomfortable. It is our analysis that the use of this language by Azra betrays a kind of resignation on the part of the student that her physical appearance is intrinsically contradictory to her Bengali heritage and that her queer identity can only be seen and authorized by white people. The testimony of the student illustrates how her religious identity and her ethnic identity are difficult to interpret outside the normative anti-queer and anti-Muslim framework by both people who share her minority ethnic heritage and those who belong to the ethnic majority. So this begs the question for us as researchers. If only white people are authorized to claim for themselves plural and complex identities, which spaces exist for students like Azra who clearly refuse to be assigned to whiteness because of their queerness? In other words, if it is undeniable that Azra is the living embodiment that there are Bengali Muslims who are also queer, why is it that many non-white LGBTQ+ people find it so difficult to receive the recognition they need? This erasure reveals the extent to which, while many of us are accustomed to, and to some extent maybe even accept, the inevitable difficulty for queer folks to find acceptance in religious spaces, the difficulty experienced by racialized Muslim people in finding acceptance and safety in queer spaces when they claim Islam for themselves is perhaps a less talked about reality. This should not be surprising when we take into account the extent to which The mainstream narrative about queer experiences in Western societies is derived from white experiences of queerness, not to mention much of the activism and the scholarship. Furthermore, both the experiences of Azra and Sumaya illustrate how complicated it is to benefit from the privilege or the security that comes from having one's own Muslimness erased. Indeed, they both recognize that not being visibly Muslim offered them a kind of protection from certain forms of physical violence directed at Muslims. However, while not being read as Muslim may protect them from some manifestations of Islamophobia, it does not protect them from anti-Black or anti-queer violence. Also, the erasure they experienced helped to reinforce the narrowing of discursive and social recognition of their multiple experiences. This narrowing is not only symbolic or spiritual, it also results ultimately in a decrease in both emotional and physical safety, since their experiences rarely constitute the starting point for political work. For Azra, the seemingly ambiguous position she occupies, not white, nor obviously Muslim, or even Bengali, contributes significantly to the general sense she has of being excluded. It's like you hope it's the best of both worlds, but it's really not. It's the worst of both worlds. So I don't really fit in either place. It's like white people are definitely not going to think that I'm white, and brown people, most of them do, but it's like really awkward, and it's not like the same vibe, and I'm treated differently. And there's always still this bias that white people have, and once they know I'm Muslim, it doesn't change anything that I look lighter. Okay. Oh my God, no. Okay, so we're gonna go to our last case study because I've been given the death signal here. The final case I'd like to explore is that of Zahra, a student who identifies as a Black Muslim Arab woman and who was born in Quebec. When Zahra started her studies at Vanier College, she wore hijab. However, by the time we conducted the interview, she had stopped wearing it. So she had the much less frequent experience of engaging with an institution as both a visible Muslim woman and, like Azra and Sumaya, as a Muslim woman who is not always recognized as so. Her description of the following excerpt of her experience when she wore hijab, and the following excerpt of her experiences when she wore hijab versus when she removed it illustrates well the question of visibility. With the hijab, I noticed that not as many people approach me. Like in class, when it's time, okay, get in groups, nobody turns to me. But when I took it off, a lot of people would talk to me, and they would sit next to me. This first testimony reflects the isolation that can come from wearing hijab in a non-Muslim academic context. In other words, while Sumaya and Azra spoke of being invisible as Muslims, Zahra's hypervisibility as a Muslim seemed to make her invisible as a peer. In the following excerpt, she describes a very serious incident that occurred while she still wore hijab. A teacher was handing the corrected exams. And when he gave it to me, I got a 70. It was not such a good grade. And he was like, oh, what do your parents say about your grades? And I was like, well, they tell me to do better, you know? And then he tells me, no, your dad wants you to fail and then stay at home and get married, right? He's saying that in front of the whole class. And I just laughed because I didn't know what to say. What am I going to say? And that just made me realize that it's not only the people my age that may have a perception, but it's the teachers. So from that point on, every time I entered a class, I was thinking, oh, is that teacher, do they believe something about me? The impact of this incident on her was great, and she named it as actually an accelerating factor in her decision to remove hijab. The hypervisibility she experienced on a regular basis had become a tremendous source of stress in her life. There was more to say, but I think my time is up, so I'd like to conclude, if that's possible, for one more minute. When we asked the student researchers why they had wanted to be part of this project, they told us that it was because they wanted to help create a different kind of narrative about Muslim experiences. Many of the interview participants said this as well. There was clearly a need on the part of these Muslim youths to speak on their own behalf and to have the opportunity to say what it meant to them to be Muslim students. Repeatedly, we received expressions of surprise as well as gratitude for a project which centered their diverse experiences. Participants also expressed hope that the knowledge generated by this project would lead to a better understanding of the realities of Muslim communities in Quebec. Their desire to speak was born from the repeated confiscation of their voice by the ubiquitous narrative that Islam and Muslims about Islam and Muslims as an imminent danger to Quebec society's stability and cohesion. They understood well how their claim to Islam deprived them of the kind of anonymity which many of their peers benefit from. We found that this tension was in fact an intrinsic part of their identity due to the place it takes up in their lives as CEGEP students, as well as Muslims in the world. They hope to go unnoticed while also ardently wishing to be seen for who they really are. They spoke about this in interviews with a clarity and a maturity which is perhaps uncommon for people their age. In fact, several of them offered keen analyses of the place they hold in contemporary Quebec society, a place that is simultaneously restricted and amplified. The objective of this paper was to highlight the considerable tensions which lie at the heart of Muslim students' experiences in CEGEP, a space between invisibility and hypervisibility. We were motivated to do this for a few reasons. Chief among them was the desire to draw attention to so-called marginal experiences when exploring the Muslim presence in Quebec. The work of Black Muslim feminist geographer Ungrievable illustrates well the myriad ways that Black Muslim experiences get erased, both discursively and in the context of political work in Quebec. Furthermore, in their work on the experiences of the LGBTQ plus Muslims in Quebec, Shahatli Rahman and Shbat have offered an important discussion of the erasure of queer Muslim experiences from public narratives of queer experiences in Quebec, except and unless it is to reiterate the incompatibility of these identities. The experiences of Muslim CEGEP students, as we have been able to understand and relay them, confirm these patterns. We also wish to respond to the homogenizing discourse about Muslim youth by illustrating the diversity and complexity of the experiences of these students. Among the many consequences of this homogenization is the double effect of rendering people invisible by erasing their individuality while also making them hypervisible by creating an uncontestable association between them and a universally despised ideology. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm from South Africa, and I almost didn't make it. A few hours before leaving, I was bitten by a spider, stung by a bee, and fractured my baby toe. So, all very, very African experiences. Thank you, Leila, for setting up that so well for me. And to all of you, to the pioneers in the room, to those that have trailblazed the way for us to be here today. We stand on your work, we work off your work, and to the fresh researchers in the promise of the hope of new research and new work that really paves the way for healing of the wounds and restoration in so many different ways. So thank you. I'd like to start this morning with a pause. And it's really a pause so that we can step back in order for us to lead forward. And I'd like to use this pause to cultivate space in building our understanding of the making of voice in intergroup dialogues in Islamophobia in higher education spaces. I'm really struck in the academy by how much work on Islam and Muslims ignores, occludes, and devalues Islamic primary sources of Al-Quran and Al-Sunnah, making us intellectually captive to knowledge systems from outside the richness of Islam. Some may even call it internalized Islamophobia, talking and writing about Islam and Muslims and Islamophobia void of the Tawhidic paradigm, akin to what I would call the elephant in the room. And so as we dialogue about the making of voice, I thought it apt as a symbolic and illustrative gesture to begin with a recitation from the Holy Quran that inspires dialogue. It is by no means meant to be a tafsir or exegesis or journeying into the meaning of ayat from the Quran or of prophetic guidance on intergroup dialoguing, but it may remind us and help us to recenter our ontological and epistemological struggles and consciousness as we do the work that will move us forward. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. This is from Surah Hujurat, and it is verse 13. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. Sadaqallahu al-Azim. O humankind, indeed we have created you from male and female and made you people and tribes that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. Indeed, Allah is knowing and acquainted. And further on in Surah Ma'idah, if God had so willed, he would have made you one community, but he wanted to test you through that which he has given you. And further on in Surah Hud, if your Lord has pleased, he would have made all people a single community, but they continue to have their differences. So having said that up, I wanted to think a little bit further about dialogue, debate, and conversation as terms where we're talking across differences, but in very different ways. The dialogue that I refer to in the intergroup dialoguing space is really not a debate about convincing others of one's position or trying to win an argument, nor is it about compromise or about consensus. It's not a discussion of merely sharing in a conversational way, but it is about engagement. So as an occupational therapist, we call this occupational engagement, the doing of dialogue, the being in dialogue, the belonging in dialogue, and then the becoming in dialoguing. And this is the segue into the question around how an occupational therapist might find herself working as an intergroup dialogue facilitator in Islamophobia. So I'm going to start right at the beginning of my lived experience back in South Africa. In the late 1940s, my grandparents and father lived in an area called District 6, together with 12 other siblings, so 13 children in all. During the apartheid era, our home was demolished, and we were forcibly relocated, forcibly removed to this area, which you see in the picture, called Lavender Hill in Retreat. So it is from this intergenerational trauma that I draw on the experience of intergroup dialoguing as I then, as a young woman, saw the transition from apartheid to post-1994, where I began to be engaged in intergroup dialoguing as a participatory member of the dialoguing around race and class in particular. The second notable experience then around intergroup dialoguing and my interest in it in terms of Islamophobia was when I took up a IIIT scholarship together with American University to move to Washington, D.C. from South Africa to do a year-long program in a Master's in International Training and Education program, where on the left you can see Bdeir, Courtney and Adrika, where as part of our project, we worked on setting up lunchtime intergroup dialoguing in Islamophobia, what we called express workshops on the campus on Islamophobia, as part of our explorations in intergroup dialoguing and the methodology on how that would look within the campus setting. And then the third experience, or the third piece of work, really came as part of my capstone, where I developed an Islamophobia intergroup dialoguing toolkit, which I'm hoping to share with you on a facilitator's e-guide to running intergroup dialoguing in higher education spaces. So I'm going to press play, and we've been through pause, we've been through rewind, and been through play. And very soon I'll transition in the play in sharing out the intergroup dialoguing key highlights from the facilitator's guide. But I do want to fast forward to the space of what I'd like to offer this, our community. And what I'd like to offer is an article that was published, that I published within GEMS, which is the Journal of Education of Muslim Societies, which was a practitioner's note on Islamophobia and the theory of change, which I'd really like to talk to in a little bit, which really talks to a collective resource that we can use to apply for the mini grants that are available at Centers for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion to develop the 7-week intergroup dialoguing facilitation, the 7-week intergroup dialogues like they have for whiteness, for anti-Semitism, for veteran care, for LGBTQI, and take up these opportunities while being very aware of that we are up against a entire structural systemic pressures that really make change very difficult. And so we're not deluded by the reality of the curricular pressures, of the faculty hires, of the policies of the universities, etc., that are intently Islamophobic. So thank you for letting me for hearing and for listening around just the structure of how I set up the thinking for today. I'm going to now transition into the e-guides so that we have highlights. And honey, let's see if you taught me well, or if I'm just a bad learner, if I'm able to successfully do that. Let's see. Clearly that did not go so well, so I'm going to call upon you. Oh, I'm gonna claim it's an age thing, me and tech, but yeah, thank you. Okay. So it's a PDF which is available online, and that needs to be developed further. It was during the year of COVID, so it really needs another, not that one. There we go. Thank you so much. So it really needs further development and more thinking around updates. But I'm going to start out with the 7-week dialoguing process, in where there are there's a call that gets sent out by Centers for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion for facilitators to become a facilitator on different topics. There are calls that go out around grant opportunities to run these 7-week course, 7-week facilitation intergroup dialogue opportunities on various topics. And we applied for a mini grant on Islamophobia, and myself and Kiran, and we were accepted. And then we had to go through the process of actually thinking through how we were going to actually develop the intergroup dialoguing design. And so we started out with thinking through or gathering key literature around number one, intergroup dialoguing and its process, and then obviously Islamophobia, and setting some kind of frame around the context of the statistics, what Islamophobia is and what some of the working definitions are, what the literature was saying around the causes and the types of Islamophobia, and in very simplistic ways that, in very simple ways, in very simple ways that would be easy for new facilitators to be able to digest, and then further share on within the intergroup dialoguing space. And then some of the, and then reviewing what some of the strategies that can be used in terms of dialoguing around intergroup dialoguing. So intergroup dialogues really seek to engage people across the difference of perspectives. So you'd have half of the group, which would be comprised of people who identify as Muslims, and half not. And over the 7 weeks, issues of identity, power, and privilege are discussed, engaged with through hot topics, through a lot of warm-ups, creative exercises, artistic experiences, facilitated by students for students in the higher education space. And the collective resource that I really wanted to share out was the theory of change that really talks to what we can do about Islamophobia on college campuses. And it is really built on the assumption that we are motivated to positively change ourselves for the better, our communities and our systems. And this alchemy of the relationships and the information that we gather and the actual intergroup dialogue process can create this change. And we see that change in measurements of outcomes in the knowledge, skills, and attitudes, in understanding, relationships, and action, with the impact of a ultimately inclusive, safe, and caring community. And so we start out with that assumption and really examine in the program design what the inputs are in terms of the logic model of resource investments, the self and other relationships that go into who is present in the intergroup dialoguing and how they have been, people have been selected, what information is being presented and co-constructed and uncovered, and then what dialogue processes are being used to create the outcomes that are needed. The activities that go from the inputs are the training cycle, activation, the recruitment of the participants, the recruitment of facilitators and faculty advisors, designing and piloting this, training facilitators, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation, and then the outputs. Ultimately, we want the outcomes to be the strengthening of individual and collective capacities for self and other relationships, building positive relationships and interpersonal skills, and consciousness raising, so that we have communities of practice for positive change. So in conclusion, I think there's a lot of synergy around the work that is happening across college campuses and opportunities that exist that really need for us to be taking up. And as an occupational therapist new to the field of working within Islamophobia, one of the insights for me has been to challenge the barriers around disciplinary restrictions around what is doable and what isn't, because because of the work that has been started around intergroup dialoguing as an occupational therapist and within Islamophobia, in recent years there are more occupational therapists now working in this area, not just in the US, but globally. And we see that at each of the occupational therapist therapy conferences year on year. And that our the colleagues that are working in anti-Semitism have picked up our cue and are also now working in intergroup dialoguing as occupational therapists within anti-Semitism. So thank you so much. Thank you, Leila. Thank you, Munir. And over to you, Zeinab. Shukran.
Us all together to talking about our research and to hearing all these fantastic talks in the last 2-3 days. So my research is mainly on digital and transnational Islamophobia, and I mainly focus on Hindu nationalists and white supremacists and the ways in which they use Twitter as a way of creating a public, affective, and emotional space to sort of target Muslims. But the research that I'm going to talk about, the paper that I'm working right now on, is completely different. Is more about the resistance and digital memorial and digital storytelling. So I appreciate any sort of comments and input in order for me to also think through it and develop some more ideas. And as I was listening to Leila and Fatima, I drew on some thoughts. I'm going to connect it back to your work also, because I think that's important to think about the digital space in relation to the work that you both are doing. So I'm just going to show. So Dr. Jiwa on the first day of panel talked about the case of Afzal family, and just I'm not going to give you all the story. I think you remember, but as you might remember, on June 6, 2021, 4 members of Afzal family were struck down by a white supremacist person, and only their son survived the attack. So my paper focuses on the aftermath of attack. So following the tragic incidents, vigils and memorials were held both online and offline to sort of mourn the loss of the Afzal family and sort of express solidarity with Muslim communities. One of the online memorial projects that was initiated after the killing of Afzal family is called National Letter of Remembrance campaign. And this memorial project is a grassroots sort of initiative that was launched by Asim Hussain, who is a Toronto-based artist. And I'm going to have an interview with him soon, inshallah. So anyway, this online campaign invites Canadian and non-Canadians, basically, of all ages and backgrounds, to write personal letters of remembrance to show solidarity to Afzal family and broader Muslim communities, and to sort of foster understanding, counter prejudice and Islamophobia, and make changes. So these are the wording that I'm using, and I'm not saying constantly quote, but some of them are quote. Anyway, so as explained in the mission section of the website, through writing letters, this platform provides a window to reflect, learn, and heal. In an interview with CBC, Hussain said that this platform shows the power of storytelling, and he argues, and I found this argument very interesting, he said that if you do tell a story, you will save a life because the stories are transformative. And I think that's something that we need to talk about it more in Q&A. So Hussein chooses a website over other social media platforms. And for me, it was very interesting because I work mainly on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And as I was listening to his argument that why he chose website, I was happy to hear that he also pays attention to the architecture and the politics of these social media platform versus website. And I'm sure all of you are on some sort of social media platform, and it sort of allows you to see many things in terms of like click-based, very click-based. So you go through things very quickly, whereas the website really demands you to sit and read stories. And I will talk about some of this story with you later. But I think having that in mind made him to really choose website over, using a social media platform per se. So in this paper, am I on the right one? Yep. In this paper, I attempt to sort of understand what are the ways in which ungrievable bodies of Muslims becomes grievable, especially on social media platforms. And to answer this question, I examined this online memorial project on Afzal family that created by Hussein. And this memorial project is an important example of digitally mediated grieving and remembrance against Islamophobia, specifically for expression of mourning for those deemed ungrievable in mainstream media and other digital spaces. More specifically, this paper explores how online memorials and grieving can create a space of resistance to racism, sexism, and religious intolerance, specifically Islamophobia, and sort of foster modes of emotive expressions not permitted or validated in mainstream media, and opens opportunities for Muslim and broader communities to participate in online memorial remembrance, and so forging a cross-cultural communal belonging in Canada and beyond. So, analyze this memorial project, I drew on Mandrell's concept of vernacular memorial making. I know it's a little bit, technical, but I explain what I mean by that. Vernacular memorial making refers to how individuals or communities create spontaneous and unofficial memories in public spaces, whether online or offline, in an attempt to respond to tragedy or loss. And this serves as a way for individuals to express grief, pay tribute to the deceased, and create a sense of community. I also draw on Zizi Papikris's concept of affective public, and it's interesting because affective public also I draw on it in the context of extremism and the ways in which different emotions and affects are created through extremist ideas. But in this case, Papikris's concept of affective public refers to the ways in which social media and digital technologies are used for dissemination of emotions, feelings, and affective experiences. And these affective publics are also shaped by the emotional response that people express and share through social media platforms. So my argument is that this online campaign for the Afzal family is an example of digital vernacular memorial making, because this campaign provides an unofficial platform for individuals from all walks of their lives to share stories and messages, share their griefs, and about the tragedy, foster empathy. And Jasmine Zain, on the very first day, you were talking about the lack of empathy and how we create that space for solidarity, and advocate for social change, participate in collective memorial making, and amplify the voices of marginalized communities, and even, and I think it's more importantly, generate support for call to address systematic discrimination and violence against Muslims. This online platform bonds individual, and that's what affective public sort of refers to here, into what Papikris has described the affective public. This affective public not only allows for collective grieving, but also foster an affective alignment with the victims of Islamophobia and others who are discriminated against. So in affective space, narrators are able to sort of express emotions that are hardly expressed or validated in mainstream media, and even if expressed, is usually minimized or dismissed, right? So these affective digital memorials are difficult heritage to work on because they represent painful, traumatic, or uncomfortable events from the past that continues to persist in our society. And as I'm talking about that, I'm thinking about Zeinab's presentation yesterday about the importance of also reflecting about the pain that researchers go through as they do this research. And working on extremist work in the last 7 years was not as difficult as working on this memorial project that I have taken up recently. It was very emotionally challenging for me to read all these stories that I will share some of them with you today. But also these anecdotes and testimonies I'm going to share showcase the opportunities that provides for ordinary people to create their own digital narratives by sharing stories of racism and Islamophobia that they have encountered. So for today, I will show some examples of the letters that have been sort of published on this website. But before I do so, I want to talk about my methodology so you have a sense of it too. So you can see the image of some of the letters that are being published, and when you click on it, the full letters you can see. So far around 127 letters are submitted to this website. And the majority of letters are mainly in English. There are very few in Urdu and French. And some of them written in a form of poetry, some of them in a form of prose. And most of them are very short in terms of length, but some of them are like go for 2-3 pages. Some users, the website requires potentially for them to put the name, age, gender, and beliefs, but you can skip it also if you don't want. So some people choose to put their information, some people just stay anonymous. So I went through all of these letters and read them closely, thematize them, and use critical discourse analysis to sort of examine them. Themes that I have identified include but are not limited to the role of media in perpetuating Islamophobia, the role of the school and education system in advancing anti-Muslim sentiment, the ways in which policies such as Bill 21 that the panelists yesterday was talking about feed anti-Muslim racism. Everyday act of racism that, again, you both were sort of reflecting on in the stories that you were saying. Constant fear of being, Muslim, ignorance towards racism, the hypocrisy of Canadian multiculturalism, and the formation of collectivities among Muslim and other related minority communities, and called for solidarity to counter Islamophobia were the themes that, as I said, I identify. So for today, I'm going to talk only about 3 of these themes, and one is everyday act of racism, constant fear of living in Canada because of being a Muslim, and the formation of collectivities among Muslim and non-Muslim through interpersonal relations. And I think it was Leila who was talking about that yesterday, about the interpersonal relation. I was interested to hear that point from her in her work. And I will conclude by showing how the online memorial project for the Afzal family is an example of digital vernacular memorial making and affective public. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the act of everyday racism. So a narrator, and I put the letter and highlight the section that I'm going to read, a narrator shares the experience of how they immigrated from, Iraq to Canada during the war. And she recalls the outbursts of racism and discrimination they faced due to their mother wearing the hijab. She says, I do remember the outbursts of racism and slurs thrown at my mom wearing the hijab as she walks down in the street. Years go on, and throughout the loneliness and the stares and glares coming from the neighbors on our street, I sit outside, wanting friends to play with. But all they know is what they hear from their parents who stare and whisper as my mom heads out. So this is very related to what Leila was talking in the case of, I think, Zahra, about how hypervisibility and visibility of her was basically depend on when she wears hijab and when she removes it. So she goes on to say, and I found this section very painful. No, indeed, this wasn't a home, but a prison. A home is a place you feel safe, neighbors that are kind and give a smile. But here it was opposite. Whenever my mom went out, it was always terrorists or the classic go back to your country. This went on for several years, and surprisingly, it still does occur today. So the narrator goes on to say that because of all the discrimination that she faced, she doesn't feel belong to Canada, and she sees herself as an outcast. And this is, again, I think is very related to the yesterday panel about internalized racism and internalized Islamophobia, and I will give you an example of that in the following slide. She goes on to say that these feelings of being an outcast and being hated made her, this feeling of an outcast and being hated made her to internalize hatred to the extent that, quote, as I kept getting older, life kept giving me many reasons to feel disgust with myself due to my Middle Eastern feature, my olive, tan skin, my big Persian nose, and my big hazel eyes filled with nothing but desperation. I noticed the structural differences between me and the girls in my class, and oh, how I wish I was one of them. So in this instance, the narrator shares how they have been subjected to Islamophobic slurs on a daily basis and being hated because of being Muslim. And this degree of violence is rarely expressed, in mainstream media, and if expressed, as I said, is often played down. Such stories showcase how the affordability of website, in this case, allow for the expression of certain emotions that are otherwise not possible. So the second theme is about fear. A subset of the letters express how they live in fear of being attacked because they are Muslim and how they take extra precautions to stay safe. For example, a narrator who identified herself as a teacher at an Islamic school said, since these events, and she's referring to the Afzal family's event and the killing of Muslims in Quebec mosque. Since these events, my guard has always been up when my classes are outside, whether just going for a walk or on a larger field trip. At the school, I sometimes elect to pray before or after my students do, specifically on Friday, to keep an eye on the doors while they pray. Sometimes I felt like maybe I was playing too much defense. But when I came to know that the terrorist was stopped just a minute away from our school, I do not regret my caution. In another example, the narrator expressed her increased anxiety for their mother who wear a hijab. She writes, the way things are going have got me a lot more nervous for my loved ones, specifically my mother who does wear a hijab. I'm always worried. I'm going to get a phone call that someone did a horrible act to her. It's unfortunate, but this is a reality many people have to go through every day. I always wonder why people can't just live in peace, especially in such a diverse country such as Canada. So what is evident here is that the fear of being Muslim is sort of predicted in the interpretation of being a Muslim. To the narrators, being a Muslim, specifically a visible one, makes them a walking target of violence. The sentence that says, I'm always worried that I'm going to get a phone call, clearly evokes the fear of, or captures the fear that is pervasive among Muslim communities. It also suggests that no one in the Muslim communities at large feel that they are safe from such violence. Also, the very last sentence I think was very interesting for me to read that says why people can't just live in peace eloquently sort of invokes feeling of sadness And again, these are the emotions I'm really interested in sort of understanding and analyzing as I'm reading this type of testimonies. So the last thing that I want to, how many minutes I have? 2 minutes? Okay, I'm going to manage to finish it, I think. So the last thing I want to cover is about the formation of collectivities among Muslim and other communities through interpersonal relation. In some stories, narrators talk about how their personal relationship with non-Muslims have changed the ways in which they are being perceived. For example, a male identify a user shared a story. He said that he was working with a lady who show him utmost respect, but his co-worker didn't know that he's a Muslim. Until one day there was a story about a Muslim man who basically mocked people in their town. So his co-worker started complaining to him about the nature of Muslims and how barbaric they are. So he asked his coworker, "Do I seem barbaric to you?" He said that his coworker was taken back, and he said, "Oh no, you're really professional, calm, and wise. I'm talking about these Islamic Muslims." So the narrator said that her coworker was embarrassed at the first, but then she ended up talking to him more until one day she said to him, quote, "You have changed the way I used to think about Muslims." Another female identified person narrated a story of a new boy who joined her high school. And according to her, the boy was new and didn't have any friend. They become best friend until their parents learned that she was a Muslim. And she said, this quote, "They were a bit taken back when they learned that I'm Muslim, as they somehow had the notion that we had practices like putting cockroaches in our hair and other very unusual things. It was good that they could see I was pretty much just like any other kid," right? So here, the narrator see themselves as the one who challenge stereotypes of Muslim through their interpersonal relationship. For example, the sentence that says that it was good that they could see I was pretty much like just like other kid clearly reflects that the users see themselves as a person who not just resists, but also see themselves as the one who can foster a better understanding of Muslim and Muslimness. So these letters are examples of vernacular memorial making because they are personal, non-official expression of grief and remembrance for the Afzal family as a family that was subjected to violence because of being Muslim. These letters are not part of an organized or institutional memorials, but rather spontaneous expressions of support and empathy from individuals. So by sharing their personal experience and feeling, the narratives are not only contributing to the creation of collective memory of the tragedy, but also they attempt to resist a hegemonic power that seeks to suppress subjective knowledge. And this also, I think, can be connected to the ways intergroup dialogue that Fatima was talking about. And I think we can talk about it more in the Q&A. Additionally, these letters can be connected to Papa Christie's concept of affective public that I talked at the beginning of my talk, as they express a strong emotion and seek to connect with others who share similar feelings about the tragedy. These writers express the feeling of shock, sadness, fear, and call for action against Islamophobia. So by sharing this personal concern and fear about the rise of Islamophobia in Canada and its potential impact on their lives, users are also contributing to a larger public conversation about the emotional toll of hate and discrimination on marginalized communities. So I'm just going to stop here and thank you for listening.
Thank you all for your presentations. In the few minutes you have left, we'll open it up for maybe a couple of questions, but just to reflect on your presentations. Leila, I was just thinking about the, lifting up the kind of questions of visibility and invisibility, but also, intersecting in multiple identities and how people navigate that. And through, at CEGEP was very enlightening. So thank you for that through the case studies of Sumaya, Azra and Zahra, but also it'd be interesting to hear some kind of male responses, because this idea about visibility, what, that's through names and other ways. So just we can discuss that. And Dr. Fatima, I was just thinking about the importance, not just of intergroup dynamics, but centering the Quran and Sunnah. I found that to be very powerful. And questions of knowledge production, I think that brings up as well. But I must say, these e-guides and toolkits, which you work so well on, we need facilitators like you too, as well, to do that work. So it's not just these e-guides that float in these, as we saw, there's critiques of these DEI spaces, right? We really need facilitators who know how to use them, and not just for them not to just become checkboxes. So thank you for modeling the facilitator role for us as well. And Zeinab, I thank you, Dr. Zeinab, for your work on questions of grievability and how the website becomes a platform, and the letter writing that you shared. I was particularly struck by, it being a kind of unofficial space, but also forms of solidarity that can come together. Maybe something to think about as well is how these spaces also become places of attack. So people coming in, sharing narratives that are not easy to, digest and navigate. So just things to think about. But any questions from you all? I know it's early. Dr. Salman?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to ask a little bit more about this notion of alternative identities and the idea of this being society for almost a counter-economic project. And I saw this clearly in the example in relation to mourning, about your family, etc. But one of the things about, of course, the internet is that it's a space that can transcend the local. And I wanted to know if there was any evidence of that actually being more than a kind of therapeutic exercise, completely located in the local, and whether that kind of alternative identities could actually, was any evidence for it spreading beyond that, and what the actual alternative was. Was it really an alternative, or was it just simply a narrative about, well, Muslims are just like everyone else, in which case it's not really much of an alternative.
Let's take a few questions at a time, so it can, Dr. Beverly.
Thank you. I wanted to say that you might expand for us. I wanted to ask Zeinab if she would expand for us a point about the stories saving lives, and perhaps, because when you were saying that, I was also thinking back to what Ryan was saying yesterday about stories, and then if we can then sort of try and close the circle and think about it in terms of all in our ways of addressing our narratives, and perhaps what we can take away from that. That's more of a sort of collective point of questioning.
Maybe a couple of questions, if there are, for our other colleagues as well. Dr. Navid, and then we'll have you guys respond.
Thank you for the panel. So Leila, I apologize if this can't words. I really want to make sure, but and my apologies if you've already covered this, but what I'm curious about is because I've done very similar research, so you're doing the same contents as well. I'm curious if you noted any sort of coping mechanisms within that certain space of how to deal with issues of race and all that stuff, Islamophobia in that space, but also if you did know sort of coping mechanisms, were they sort of they differ based on gender? So you can comment on that.
Okay, let's start with those. Please.
Thank you for the question. So I'm going to start with your question first. That sentence, that quote was from the reason, and my understanding that he said that stories for saving lives. When I read those stories, to me, as a person who had read stories of students for 17 years, now shifting my perspective and now looking from the eyes of victims are making me to think, okay, how is this group of saving lives, right? And I think what we've done, these stories do, is that they make you to feel the pain to the core of your body. And again, if you're going to see lives only as I identify with and depression and anxiety that the families mentioning in our case. And I think these slow deaths that are happening to these victims on a daily basis, that they are subjected to racism, sexism, and discrimination because of their autism. And this is story that they are sharing with us. We get a space for us to see in front of eyes. I think that's what we mean by saying life. But also, you're right, it depends on narrators and testimonies of the other side, but also the manager. I also have thousands of these stories of streamers talking about how Muslims have basically taken their space, taken their job, taken their lives, and maybe I never felt that pain in the way that I felt this pain. And I don't know, maybe even being a Muslim makes me to be biased, but I'm sure maybe from and the level of pain was more than the testimonies and this level of fear and sadness was like great difference. So again, maybe it's interested in I want to answer your question. It's hard to basically but if I your question, I think so. This goes back to the architecture of website. So architecture of website doesn't allow us to create that kind of interactive relationship between users. So as on social media, it would be much easier to answer that question. So on Twitter, you can share, you can like that, it's more like better, right? Website doesn't allow, some websites do allow you to leave a message and response. So it's hard to say, but there were stories where people are from, for example, I'm from Pakistan, from UK, I'm from here and there, talking about the ways in which these stories relate to their Afro stories. So I think even in the Muslim majority countries, they were also reflecting on that. And I think what that tells us is that, so again, being interested in digital states, only making me to think about these stories it makes to actually sit for at least 10 to 15 minutes to read and reflect and then comment on the stories without being immediately able to make that connection with that specific story that you're ahead. So it's hard to say if that local transnational is happening as it can imagine with other social media platforms, but again, going to different select can tell you yes, that happens, or not maybe that the connection is being made by users.
Thank you. Responses?
Just to respond to your remark about sort of the gender distribution, we have very few male applicants for the positions of street researchers, and for the 3 years, all of the street researchers were women. And in terms of respondents, we also had vast majority was on in school, and I would say we had on 40 teachers on this, we had 85 for the male, and all the rest of them. So it's not, I don't feel comfortable with pronouncing myself in very general terms about sort of this male student respondents. And in terms of coping mechanisms, let's answer your question directly, because things were not articulated in a way that was that direct by the students, and we didn't ask the question about the coping mechanisms directly. But one of the things that Zeinab talked about yesterday in the presentation is the ways in which there is some level of denial. And a really important moment for us in our work was, I would say near the end of the first year, this was a 2-year project, near the end of the first year, in the context of one of the interviews, well, throughout the research project, students would, during that they'd say things like, well, it's not that bad. And then they'd say, this thing happened. And then they'd say, but it's not really that bad though. There was that time when the teacher did this or the student did that. But overall, it's not that bad. And so for them, this sort of, this duality of it's not that bad, but all these other things are happening. Really, this was a recurrent theme. And one of the interviews was especially remarkable for us in that way because one of the questions we didn't ask, but which came up systematically, was the question of, well, we asked about where they felt safe practicing their faith, but we talked about the campus. And we didn't think to ask about public transportation. And that came up regularly for the students, how they navigated public transportation, the metro especially. And regularly we heard from students who said things like, well, when I go to the metro, I always stand with my back against the wall so that nobody will push me. I think it's important to take a minute just to sort of take that in. And in one of the interviews, when the student said that to us, we had said to her, well, do you feel safe practicing? And she said, oh yes, I feel safe. And then we said, well, what makes you safe? Oh, well, I do this and I do that. So then Krista, my partner, looked at her and she said, so actually what you're naming for us is all the ways you make sure that you're safe. It's not the institution, it's not the infrastructure, it's not the teacher, it's not the guidance counselor, it's not the school psychologist, it's not the director general of the school, it's you. And we all sort of, this was really significant, we just looked at each other and just went, okay, this is it. And then we realized that for 3 years, we've been hearing from students about the ways in which they orchestrate their safety, both consciously and unconsciously. And for us, this was something that was really sort of another testimony to that, and then I'll stop. But one of the students said to us, I have a long way to come to school. It's a long sort of ride. And she said, I used to fall asleep on the metro. But since 2019 and the passage of Law 21, I never allow myself to fall asleep on the metro. And so we asked her why. And she said, because I know now that something can happen to me. And really, we heard this more than once, more than twice, more than 3 times. So I think their coping mechanism is akin to survival mechanisms, really a question of actual physical safety and preservation. And then within the institution, I think there was a mix of trying to keep a low profile so they wouldn't be too noticed, but then also when they were afforded the opportunity to speak up about Islam or about Muslim experiences, if they felt safe with a particular teacher, and the way that they were invited to speak was respectful, and they gave some degree of agency in their response, might respond and say, and talk about that was also a coping mechanism because it gave them a sense of power over the narrative in those spaces.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Fatima, would you like to add anything? You sure? Yeah. I just want to maybe, well, thank you, but I just want to lift up, the conversations we're having here in the context of the conference as a whole, right? Life stories and narrative, and the power of narrative, and sort of taking back spaces through narrative, goes side by side with the questions we've been asking around data, quantitative data, and the importance and need for this data as well. So, one of the things that's coming clear through this conference is that it's both. It's not either or, right? That it's both of these things that we're seeing that, are having a profound impact, and hearing these stories. And then the questions that this raises, and it's to Dr. Salman's point, is about, this is not just about relatability or whose lives matter and how they're registered, because my humanity is dependent on you recognizing me just as the same as you. But in some ways, my humanity should also be dependent on our difference, right? And so, in fact, Dr. Fatima's point about, knowledge and knowledge production, and drawing from the Islamic tradition as a source, and bringing that into the public, provides different ways in which to see the world, as the panel on Qatar so well showed us, right? That there's different ways in which our registers of our humanity are made visible, not just through our sameness, but through our difference. So thank you all very much for this panel. There are refreshments, and we just have a really quick turnaround. But there are refreshments in the lounge for those of you who would like. But thank you very much.